Good afternoon. I'm Stephanie Weiss, the Secretary of the New York, New Jersey Regional Board. And we are really excited to have this group come together today for the first session of our Board Leadership Institute. And this is going to be a series of Zoom calls that hopefully one day we'll all get to be together in person and do this in a different way. But for now, we'll do this virtually. And I'm really excited to share this initiative with you because we have a wonderful new regional director, Scott Richmond. And when Scott came and when we get new people in the organization, new ideas come to the table. And this was one of the first things that he thought of as a great way for our board and the New Jersey Advisory Board and the New York Advisory Board and the regional board to come together and do a deeper dive into the work that is currently being done at ADL. And many of us have been involved for many years and things have evolved and changed, and yet so much stays the same. Our mission, of course, being the core of everything that we do. So thank you, Scott, for this wonderful idea. And I think we've got a great turnout. So everyone agrees with you that this is a great way to get together. And just to preview some of the future sessions that we'll do, we're starting today with Ken Jacobson, who is going to talk to us about ADL's history. He, as many of you know, is the longest standing employee at ADL. He has had so many positions. He really needs no introduction, and there's no person who is better positioned to tell us about the history of the organization. Going forward, we'll also do a deep dive like this on civil rights, law enforcement, international affairs, education, and the Center on Extremism and Center on Technology and Societies. So this is a work in progress, so please share your feedback. This is, as I said, the first session. We'd love to incorporate your feedback going forward, and it's meant to be interactive. So Ken's going to speak for a little bit, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Ken to our group. And he's spoken with us many times, and we're really grateful to have you here with us today. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Great to be with you folks. I think almost all of you, but most of you for sure. And so one of my unofficial roles at ADL over the years, Stephanie mentioned that I've had many roles, but one of them is I'm sort of the unofficial historian of ADL. And as I tell people, no, it's not true. I was not there at the creation, even though I've been at ADL for a long time. But I do have a tremendous interest in history in general, and the history of ADL. So what I'm going to do is sort of try to run through that history and try to frame it along the lines of three different periods in ADL history. It's not meant to be scientific, but it's sort of useful to give a kind of overarching frame for that history. Stephanie mentioned that ADL is about continuity and change, and that's what this history is really about in many ways. Is an amazing continuity. Of 1913, ADL was founded, and our founding mission is as relevant today as it was then. And so the fundamentals of ADL remain in place, but there obviously are so many changes in structure, changes in administration, change in content, changes in approach, which all of which I will talk about as we run through this history. So let's just go right to it. And what I like to do is to, as I said, divide that history from 1913 to the present into three periods. The first period I call the period of ADL's creation or development. And I estimated from 1913, of course, the founding year, probably mostly through World War II. Now, again, this isn't a science, but it's a framework. The second period I call the period of maturation, where ADL truly became a mature, sophisticated organization. And that was in the post-war period. I estimate probably up to early 1970s, and then up through the current day is what I call the modern period of ADL. And so that's the framework that I like to use to try to give a sense of how ADL developed over the years and how, as I said, remained very much true to its original mission. So, of course, we don't today use this term as much as we have historically, but we've often referred to ADL's dual mission as embodied in the charter of ADL to combat the defamation of the Jewish people and to work for equal justice for all. Those two elements of our charter, which were developed first by Sigmund Livingston, our founder, and was signed by 100 leading American Jews at the time in 1913, has remained, in effect, our Constitution, the very moving force that we cite all the time for the work that we do. Now, that dual mission was both extremely traditional and also very revolutionary. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, it was traditional because it was part of Jewish lore. You go back to the sage Hillel 2,000 years ago, you know, all the Jewish college groups are named after him. They're called the Hillels for good reason. He was a leading thinker, had tremendous influence on the Jewish people. He had the very famous line where he said, if I am not for myself, who will be? Which was really interpreted as the first part of our mission. We have to be proud of who we are in those, it was as Jews, and we have to stand up for ourselves. If we don't do it, who will stand up for us? And then the second part of what Hillel talked about, after he said that first point, he said, if I'm only for myself, what am I? Meaning, as an individual, you first have to have pride in your identity and stand up for your own values, but then beyond, you have to go beyond that if you're a serious human being. And that really was what ADL said early on, which was, first we have to stand up against anti-Semitism, protect the Jewish people, but we need to do more than that. We have to work for equal justice for all. And so in many ways, this was a very traditional concept, but it was also revolutionary. When ADL was founded in 1913, it was a period of time when other civil rights organizations had been coming into being. The NAACP was in 1908, the American Jewish Committee in 1906. There were the theme of standing up for one's own community had really begun to take hold, and minority communities realized that it was important to stand up for protect their own communities. But the fact that we had the second part of our mission was something it was really unheard of for a minority community. In other words, it was enough of a struggle just to organize to stand up for oneself. But to say in one's charter that besides standing up for oneself, we're also going to stand up for others was truly revolutionary. And so I just think that we shouldn't take for granted how much foresight our founders had in including that in our mission. And so much so that one of my points about this first period in our history is that we actually did not do a lot in that second part of our mission in those early years for a variety of reasons that I'll just briefly talk about, but it really demonstrated how far advanced we were in having this kind of a concept. As a matter of fact, I kind of analogize the duality of the mission, and particularly the second part, to the First Amendment of the Constitution when it came to the issue of church-state matters. It's the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. But what I mean by that is the language was there in the First Amendment. The truth is, in this country in the 19th century, if you went around to schools, for example, around this country, they were not only teaching, but practicing Christianity in schools all the time. In other words, the country wasn't ready at that period of time truly to institute what later became the wall of separation between church and state. In the 20th century, when the country was ready for that, the fact that the language was there in the First Amendment provided the legitimacy to really create that wall of separation that we consider one of the great virtues of our society. And that's sort of the analogy I draw to that dual mission. The truth is, we've had the language about working for equal justice for all, but we didn't do a lot about it in those early years. But the fact that the language was in the charter of ADL meant when the time was right, then that could be legitimized. And I'll talk about that as we go along. But I always feel, again, it comes back to the point of how much foresight the founders had. And of course, it also gets into the question of the relationship between standing up against anti-Semitism and working for equal justice. And I always feel there's a moral side to it that stands on its own. There's also an instrumental side to it about how working for others has a practical impact on the fight against anti-Semitism. Now, I will say one thing. There's a kind of myth that ADL was founded in light of the Leo Frank case. I assume most of you have heard of Leo. Leo Frank was a New York Jew who married a young Jewish woman from Atlanta whose father owned a pencil factory. Leo Frank worked in the factory. In 1913, Leo Frank was arrested and charged with the murder of a young woman who had worked in that factory. And it became a huge story. There was an infamous trial that had a lot of anti-Semitism in it. Eventually in 1915, Leo Frank was pulled out of prison and hung in the most infamous lynching of a Jew in American history. The fact that Leo Frank case came up in 1913 led a lot of folks to say, well, of course, ADL was founded the same year, therefore, most likely it was connected. Actually, Sigmund Livingston had the idea for an ADL as far back as 1908. He actually presented it early on, and it didn't happen. So what the Leo Frank case demonstrated, however, was how smart the founders of ADL were. When the Leo Frank case took place and played out over 2 years, the founders of ADL said, boy, we did an important thing, and the need for an ADL is very profound. So I think it's just, yeah. So let me just now run through this early period and basically say that the way I think of this first period up to World War II is that anti-Semitism was rife in America, particularly in the 1930s. It was probably the worst time of anti-Semitism in this country's history. There were extremist groups, there were anti-Semitic activities going all over. I associate the history of anti-Semitism between 1913 and World War II with 4 names. And just to give you a sense that anti-Semitism was not on the margins in this period for ADL, it was very much mainstream. The 4 names are Leo Frank, whom I just mentioned, and the fact that this was the most infamous lynching of a Jew in American history that took place in this period. The second name is Henry Ford, the famous industrialist, the founder of the Ford Motor Company, who was infamous for disseminating through his publication in Dearborn, Michigan, known as the Dearborn Independent, for years disseminated the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the terrible forgery that led to the deaths of thousands, and you could argue even millions of Jews, the fraudulent document created by the Russian secret police that claimed that they discovered the intentions of Jews to conquer, to take over the world. And this kind of fabrication was spread by Henry Ford, of all people. So Henry Ford, an American industrial hero, was spreading anti-Semitism. ADL made representations. Years later, in 1942, Henry Ford finally apologized for disseminating the protocols. But the damage was huge, that so many thousands of people who respected Ford were exposed to the idea that the Jews were secretly plotting to take over the world. And it gave that terrible concept, which of course was used by Hitler to justify his actions. Here in America, it had a life of its own because of Henry Ford. The next name is Father Charles Coughlin. Father Charles Coughlin was known as the radio priest. He was on the air every Sunday night. Millions of Americans listened to his broadcast through the 1930s. And he did not engage in subtle anti-Semitism. He engaged in the very same kind of anti-Semitism that Henry Ford disseminated in the protocols. Every Sunday night, he talked about how the Jews were in control of everything, were the source of evil in the world, all the worst kind of tropes and stereotypes about Jews. And millions and millions of Americans listened to Father Charles Coughlin and absorbed what he had to say, and there were basically no serious protests. In other words, Henry Ford was an example of mainstream anti-Semitism. So was Father Charles Coughlin. These are the kinds of things that today are unimaginable going in the mainstream, but were really a part of life in the 1930s. And of course, the last name is in many ways the most famous name, and that was Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh, of course, was an American hero, the first solo flight across the Atlantic in the spirit of St. Louis. I'm a big sports fan, and in New York, all of us are New Yorkers, New Jersey. When a sports team wins a professional championship, we have ticker tape parades. Wall Street, well, the largest ticker tape parade in the history of New York took place back when Charles Lindbergh returned from his solo flight. To this day, that was still the largest one. He was truly an American hero. And Charles Lindbergh in 1940 was a key member of the America First movement, which was a movement intended to keep America out of the war, which on the face of it was a legitimate movement, but of course it was very much pro-Nazi in many ways. Lindbergh had relations with the Nazis, and he gave an infamous speech that Philip Roth, by the way, in his novel has made famous more recently. He gave a speech in Des Moines, Iowa in 1940 saying that the only people who want to drag us into war against the Nazis are the all-powerful Jews. So here it was, you had Henry Ford, Charles Coughlin, and Charles Lindbergh, all key American figures disseminating the worst kinds of anti-Semitism. And the point being that this was a period when anti-Semitism was not on the margins of society, but was very much mainstream, even though, again, for so many American Jews, obviously living in America was incomparable compared to anything in Europe, even prior to the horrors of the Nazi period. But the area where ADL got most involved and developed an early reputation was on the issue of extremism. We early on developed Monitoring Extremists. There's a book that I strongly recommend by Stephen Ross called Hitler in Los Angeles. And it's a book about Nazi activity in the 1930s in California and efforts to do all kinds of terrible things to gain influence, even to threaten many Jews and others. And the book is all about, in effect, it's all about ADL's expertise in monitoring and infiltrating extremists in ways to counter the efforts of Nazis in California in this period to do great harm. It's a book worth reading, if nothing else, just to get that sense of ADL's role dealing with extremism. When Pearl Harbor took place, so remember America was neutral until December 7th, 1941. When Pearl Harbor took place, the FBI came to ADL asking us for what information we had about Nazis in America, because as long as America was neutral, the government could not really monitor Nazis the way they needed to do. Once we were at war with Germany, suddenly Nazis in America were the enemy, and ADL had the expertise, and we provided information. We, in other words, had truly established a reputation for investigating extremists already in this period of time, and that became a signature of ADL, obviously, going forward. Now, structurally, in this period up to World War II, ADL was in many ways a very ad hoc organization. we didn't have the kind of organized structure either in our national headquarters or around the country that later came into being. And aside from that, there was no international work at all. As a matter of fact, when you read books about the role of the American Jewish community during the Holocaust, most such books are extremely critical of the American Jewish community for not doing enough when the Jews of Europe were imperiled. There isn't a lot of criticism of ADL, and that's not necessarily a compliment to ADL, because no one expected ADL to have an international agenda. We were part of B'nai B'rith. When ADL was founded, we were founded by B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith was an international organization, and it basically said to its ADL group, you stick to America, we are the world part of the organization. And so ADL, through Arnold Foster, for example, who was very active here in New York, we would combat Nazis in the streets of New York. I live in the Upper East Side, and those of you who know the Upper East Side, 86th Street and 3rd Avenue, which today is quite a Jewish neighborhood, was the center of Nazi activity in America. The Bund was out there, and ADL folks would go there and debate with Nazis, sometimes get into some fistfights with Nazis. That was seen as ADL's role. It was not seen as having an international agenda. B'nai B'rith said, you stay out of it. And so that became significant when I talk about the post-war period. That was quite stark that ADL had. So here I'm speaking now about areas that later on changed dramatically. So number one, in this early period, there was no international agenda. Number two, and this is hard for anyone who knows ADL at all over many decades, in all the years I've worked there, ADL tried to avoid public statements and commentaries. As a matter of fact, the few regional offices we had, if a regional director would be quoted in the media, sometimes they'd be criticized because we were sort of in that mode that was very typical of the Jewish community in those years, of a kind of work behind the scenes, shah still. And I'll tell you a brief anecdote that really highlights this. When Mitt Romney was running the first time for president in 2008, Mormons were astonished at the anti-Mormon stereotypes that cropped up during the campaign. And they came to ADL. 3 leading Mormon businessmen came to ADL. And my colleague then, Deborah Lauder, and I were dealing with these Mormon businessmen because they wanted to create a Mormon anti-defamation league. And we were encouraging them, saying, sure, we'd be happy. They said, well, maybe we'll send some folks to see how your civil rights division works. And then we didn't hear from them for quite a while. And then finally, one of the businessmen called us and we said, what's going on? And he said, well, you know, the Mormon church is the second biggest hierarchy next to the Catholic Church, in the sense the apostles make all the decisions. And he said that the apostles said, we don't want to create this organization because we think it will make anti-Mormon activity in America even worse. And I said to him, we were there once. In the 1930s, that was a prevalent attitude in the Jewish community. Shah still was the expression, a kind of Yiddish expression. Don't make too much noise about anti-Semitism, because if you make too much noise, you're only going to make it worse. And I said to the Mormon businessmen, I said, we learned quickly that that's not the way you function in the United States, and you will learn as well. And so the point is, it was amazing, and this all changed after the war, but there was a sort of a strong tendency about be careful what you say or don't say too much. And there was one other thing that was astonishing as we later on saw the difference, which that our Chicago office, which before the war was our headquarters, put out a document teaching Jews how to behave so as not to create anti-Semitism. In other words, it's sort of like blaming the Jews' behavior for the. So I tell all these things because it was a very different time, and there was a tremendous amount of insecurity in the community and even within ADL. And this is part of what the pre-war period was. Now I want to quickly jump to the post-war period where things changed in a million ways for ADL. And the one thing that remained steady was that mission, but on so many levels, content, approach, structure, development, all the things international, all the things that really came to matter, all went through a tremendous amount of change. And so this is a period that I call the maturation. I've said to colleagues over the years, if there were a time machine and I could go back in time, at what point would I land and be able to identify the ADL as something recognizable today? In other words, when did ADL become this mature, even though there's always been change? And I would say it probably took place around in the 1950s, and for a variety of factors that I'll talk about, that all came together. But first, let me talk about content. And the first one I want to talk about is the civil rights work we did. And here's, as I said earlier, the moment was not right before the war. First of all, there weren't the huge numbers of anti-discrimination laws around. There wasn't the kind of coalition work that later on became so vital for civil rights work. And anti-Semitism, as I said, was so dominant and so important that ADL mostly focused on that first part of the mission. After the war, of course, as we all know, historically, things changed so much. People came back from Europe, African Americans came back from the war and were not ready to put up with all the horrors that had happened earlier on. You know, I again, being a big sports fan, I always think that Jackie Robinson's entry into baseball in 1947 was truly a historic moment. Just in those days, baseball truly was America's national pastime, and the fact that no African American had ever played in a major league game was symbolic of so much that was wrong with this country. And this was already, and ADL, even before the civil rights movement in the late 40s, started to engage in activities. For example, we had an office in Florida, and our director, Alex Miller, made sure that all the events that ADL held down there were integrated, which was something that was very rare. We started to put out some publications against bias, and we participated in a famous court case in 1948, Shelley versus Kramer, against restrictive housing covenants, in which we argued against attributing undesirable social traits to racial or religious groups. So we were putting our toes in the water in this kind of thing. Obviously, for ADL, as for so many others, the big moment, the first big moment, was Brown versus Board of Education. Of course, the case was decided, the most famous case of the 20th century was decided in 1954, but ADL had to make a decision whether to enter the case or not around 52. And it's fascinating to read the National Commission discussions and debate about ADL's entry or not into the case. And I always remember one quote from a B'nai B'ritha from Mobile, Alabama, who got up in the middle of the discussion and said, if ADL files a amicus brief in Brown versus Board, Jewish blood will be flowing on the streets of Mobile, which really reflected about how vulnerable Jews in the South and who were part of B'nai B'rith and ADL felt about the changing situation. And to the credit of our leadership overwhelmingly decided this was important, both for the fight against anti-Semitism and to do the right thing, that ADL should be involved and signed on in the most famous case of Brown versus Board. And that began a period of time that went through the 60s, in which every major civil rights moment, ADL leadership was there. If you come to our office near Jonathan's Greenblatt's office, there's a huge picture of Ben Epstein, then the national director of ADL in the 60s, standing next to Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King Jr., together with other civil rights leaders. This was at a time of working for the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 64. Dori Shari was the national chair of ADL, the famous director, and producer, Hollywood producer, and he led a group of 120 leading Jews to lobby in Washington for the Civil Rights Act of '64. ADL, of course, was present at the March of Washington in Selma, in all the big moments. It just became part and parcel of ADL's work, and it was, again, the opening up of America and the opening up of ADL in the civil rights arena. I remember Abe Foxman used to be asked, what's the single most important thing that happened at ADL in all the years? And he had an interesting answer, and I think I understood what he said it was our work in leading to the anti-mask law that was passed in the state of Georgia in the early 1950s. And the point being that what was happening, this is a time when the Klan was running rampant and was really growing once again in reaction to movements towards civil rights. And ADL always had a position of protecting the right of expression even by haters. But we also knew that something had to be done. And our group down there took the initiative to get passed a law that said the Klan had every right to demonstrate, as hateful as they are, but they don't have a right to demonstrate anonymously with their faces covered in those hoods. And so the law said they could continue to demonstrate, but they couldn't do it with the hoods covering their faces. And this was transformative in two ways. One, it had a huge impact on the Klan, because anyone who's ever seen those pictures of the hooded Klansmen with the torches, it's a hugely intimidating picture. Without the hood, suddenly they're your next door neighbors, and they lost that aura of power and intimidation. So it was part of an effort that had a real impact on the Klan itself, which in itself made it worthy of it. But it spoke to something much bigger, which really was a harbinger of the work that ADL has done for decades ever since. And that was, we've always believed in the right of the First Amendment, free speech, but we always believed that you had to do something within the context of that, and that is to expose the haters to the light of day, literally and figuratively in this case. And what it meant was that the work of ADL was to become the experts on the hate groups and to educate the public to who they are and what they do and what the dangers they pose, and then to get folks to understand and to combat and to fight this kind of hate. And so it really set the standard in so many ways for the work of ADL over many, many decades. The second part of this period of time, so the civil rights work, and as part of the second part of our mission, we also became in this period what our director then of our program division referred to as the leader in intercultural education. Today, the words that are used are multicultural, but in those days, it was referred to as intercultural education. We did the promotion of teaching, teachers, and all kinds of guides on bias, so that we picked up the mantle not only of the advocacy on the one side, but of the education on the other side with regard to civil rights. And this became a hallmark of ADL. And again, meaning that the second part of our mission became real. On the other hand, this was the period that ADL made the most impact on anti-Semitism. You have to understand, for Jews, up until this period, life in America obviously was 100 times better than it was in Europe, but there was what I would call non-official institutional anti-Semitism in this country, and it manifests itself particularly in three areas: university admissions, jobs, and housing. University admissions was the area that ADL first took up in this period in the early 50s. We worked with the American Council of Education and did a series of investigations and affidavits asking university presidents, particularly Ivy League schools, but not only, whether in fact your university had unofficial quotas limiting the numbers of Jews coming into your university. And what was so startling was that they got honest answers. And most of these universities admitted that they had such quotas. And this became a huge national story and really embarrassed these universities to such a degree that it really began to have an impact. And as I say, if you start this period in the early 50s and you go to, say, 1970, by 1970, almost all of these non-official quotas had dissipated and disappeared, and Jews could be getting into these universities based on their skills and their abilities. And indeed, I always think of Princeton was one of those leading schools that had that. And when I remember when they had the first Jewish president a few years later, some of us used to make jokes about how some of the old folks there would be turning over in their graves to think that Irving Shapiro is the president of Princeton University. And it really opened things up. And so what took place in universities starting in the early 50s was followed suit. And again, ADL played a significant role in both the employment area and the housing area. We did studies of key industries that everyone knew that Jews were either excluded or there were glass ceilings: oil, insurance, banking. Everybody knew in those days that Jews could not go very far in those industries. And we did major studies and exposed the again, what I call non-official institutional quotas. And similarly in the housing, the secret covenants and housing. Now, again, all of these things I'm talking about were incomparably worse for African Americans, and I'm not trying to suggest that for Jews they were anything like what but this had a real impact on Jewish life. And the fact that ADL played such a significant role in largely eliminating these non-official quotas over a period of time fundamentally transformed Jewish life in America. And I always argue that probably from the 1970s on, Jewish life in America not only became by far the most comfortable life of any Jewish community in the world, but I would argue in the 2,000-year history of the diaspora, that no Jewish community in this period of time, once we got rid of these non-official quotas, that Jewish life just became completely different. Okay, let me just, there's so much to cover, and I know there's a time factor, but let me just quickly go through the other element that was completely different was the international. As I said earlier, we weren't even expected to. Our leadership after the war, due to a variety of factors, said, we're not a serious organization when 6 million Jews have been murdered, when the state of Israel comes into being and is under siege. We have to do this, and we're in a unique situation as American Jews to have impact on the situation of Jews around the world and in Israel, both because America, unlike before the war, when America was isolationist, and I won't go through that, but I have a whole thing about what I call the quirk of history that created a bipartisan foreign policy after the war and led to America being the leader in the world, which meant that America could have a huge impact on Jewish life elsewhere. And together with that was that now American Jews were becoming the most secure Jewish community with a tremendous sense of responsibility. And for ADL, all this meant that the international agenda was something that we had to take seriously. We created a European Affairs Department, then a Latin American Affairs Department. In 1966, we created a Middle East Affairs Department. Abe Foxman was the first director of Middle East Affairs. I was the fourth one. We opened up an office in Jerusalem in 1977. We've had others through the years, but international issues became a vital part of the work of ADL, with the realization if we're serious about protecting Jews, then we have to play a role internationally. And because of the fact that America was a leader in the world, we had opportunities to have impact. Let me just talk about one other area during this period of transformation, and that was structural. The structural change of ADL was tremendous in this period. There was a fellow from Omaha, Nebraska, whose name was Colonel Schlesinger. In the early 50s at a National Commission meeting, he stood up and made a proposal saying that ADL, if we're serious about the work we do, we have to create a structure that covers every part of the United States. We have to create regional offices that will cover all the areas of the country. And that led to what we now know, which is a regional office structure that doesn't only include the big cities where the offices are, but the regions in which they are. So for example, the Atlanta office is based in Atlanta, but it covers the Carolinas and it covers Tennessee. And each office has a greater jurisdiction sometimes than the region. And this was the concept that ADL had to cover the United States. How it works out is always a question. I think sometimes we don't pay as much attention to those areas outside the major cities, but conceptually that was the change. And of course, in the national thing, we moved to New York and we created the kind of structure that we have now. We created a civil rights division, eventually an international affairs division, a program and education division, and a serious development and administrative thing. So all of this took place in this period. None of it had truly existed except in an ad hoc basis. And so by the end of the 1970s, ADL had become a fully formed organization in all of these ways. And of course, as I said earlier, it was really ludicrous that the idea that, remember I mentioned that there was someone in the Chicago office who created a document teaching Jews how to avoid anti-Semitism. Well, as soon as Arnold Foster and Ben Epstein and Arnold Foster became the heads of the organization in the late 40s, the first thing they did was to fire this guy and say, that's not the way ADL's function. We've got to fight anti-Semitism for what it is and not to blame Jews for being victims of anti-Semitism. All right, let me just run through the modern period, and then I'll stop. I've probably gone on too long already. But in the period since then, of course, is taking the structural and the conceptual ideas that truly really matured in that earlier period, and then just working them out in a very different environment and different world. I'll just, instead of really trying to go through everything, I just want to mention a few of the key areas where ADL has played really the significant role over these last decades. And I would say since Jonathan has come, the area that I think that he's most really added to ADL is in focusing on data and really trying to substantiate a lot of the things that sometimes we always knew in our gut, or we talked about anecdotally. So in so many areas, whether it's online hate or any of those things, I think we've been working and continue to work on data, on all sorts of elements of hate. But over this period of these years, I would just talk about a few things. First was our playing the key role in the passage of the anti-boycott legislation in 1977 and 1978. You may remember that when the Arabs failed to destroy Israel in the War of Independence, they turned to an economic boycott to strangle Israel, including boycotting any company or individual who would want to do business with Israel. ADL got involved early on by, again, trying to shame American companies, that we would do press conferences identifying companies that refused to do business. It became big stories, but it wasn't sufficient. We worked with the Business Roundtable in the 1970s and got passage of two pieces of legislation, one in 1977, it was a commerce legislation, the other in 78 through Treasury, both of which are on the books, and really did the most to upend the Arab boycott, which made it illegal not only for American companies to submit to the Arab boycott, but actually even to answer any questions of the Arab Boycott League. And it just really played, and we were the key players at the table on that issue. The second area where we were the key players was hate crime legislation. Our Civil Rights Division in the early 80s developed what became known as the model hate crime legislation that was eventually upheld unanimously in 1993 by the Supreme Court. Another piece of potential legislation was rejected for not making a distinction between hate speech which is constitutionally protected and hate activity. ADL's legislation made the difference. We were the leading players and have remained the leading players on hate crimes. We still are working to try to get 50 states. It's now up with the passage in Georgia of hate crime legislation. We're now up to 46 states, and we continue to work and we educate and we work on the federal legislation. The main obstacle in recent years has been the issue of LGBTQ and those issues and applying them to hate crime legislation. But we've made tremendous progress, and ADL was the leading player. The third one is the more recent Stop Hate for Profit campaign that I'm sure you're familiar with from this past summer. And that really was taking the area of how do we deal with a much more complex issue of free speech versus hate on the internet, and the internet, of course, has changed so many things. And we led a campaign that we thought would be a sort of minimal one, and turned into a huge campaign in which over 1,000 institutions and companies joined in with ADL in not advertising on Facebook for 1 month. And I think it was a very important effort. I would just add a few other areas. Our development through our Boston office of a World of Difference programming really turned education work, which had already become important in the 50s and 60s, into a more systematized work that we've been doing in schools. We do it with the FBI, with the CIA. We've done training overseas. Our work in anti-bias education really took off in that period of time. Another vital program that sometimes people don't hear enough about, which I consider one of the most impactful of any that we've done over the years, was our Bearing Witness program. Bearing Witness was our program which was started in DC in the early 90s. And over a quarter of a century, we trained about 2,500 Catholic school teachers. And each of those teachers would spend a week with ADL. I would give the initial talk of that week. I would do a 3-hour history of anti-Semitism covering 2,000 years. And it was amazing that, I'd be talking a lot about the role of their church in the history of anti-Semitism. And the willingness of teachers to hear difficult stuff was just a reflection of how far Catholic-Jewish relations had come since Vatican II in the 60s. And that our whole purpose was to make sure that the teachings of the church filtered down so that young Catholic kids were not learning the kinds of things that they learned historically that played such a role in the sorry history of anti-Semitism. And so I think what we did, if you do a multiply effect, if we trained 2,500 teachers and you think about each teacher, how many students each teacher over the years has educated in using the work of ADL, I think it's remarkable. And there are all kinds of other things I could talk about, but I think I'm gonna just stop. The last thing I'll mention is the work we've done in polling. More and more, it's again part of the data thing. The data things, of course, includes ADL's annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents, that all of our regions play the key role in providing the information, but also the polling that we've done. We've done, since the 90s, we've done every few years polling of the American people on anti-Semitic attitudes. But in 2014, we did the largest worldwide survey, our global anti-Semitism poll, in which we interviewed 101,000 people in 53 countries, and we did an assessment of anti-Semitic attitudes around the world. So our reputation and the data side of things, whether it's incidents, whether it's polling, whether it's online hate, grows immensely through the years. Anyway, this is my quickly running through this history, trying to give you a sense, as I said, both of the continuity of ADL and of the tremendous changes that have gone along. And I think I'll stop here and leave a little bit of time for some questions.
Kenny, thank you so much. That was a lot to get through. I can't believe you did all of that in such a short period of time. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I think the best way to do this, if you raise your hand, I see, or you can raise the virtual hand. Lawrence Cooper, if you want to ask your question, I see you raising your hand. You're on mute. We still can't hear you.
Try again.
Hello.
How's that?
Perfect.
That work? Hey, Ken, it's always great hearing you. I've heard you over the years, and I always look forward to that opportunity. And what you did today just indicates that you are indeed the institutional memory of the Anti-Defamation League. And I
That's
would
another
make it,
nice way of saying that I'm old, but it's okay.
well, I'm old, but you can't say that of me. So it's meant as a compliment very sincerely. My suggestion is you have given over 100 years of ADL history in 45 or so minutes. Wouldn't it be wonderful if this was recorded, your talk today, and put in some kind of a pamphlet and disseminated amongst all the regions in ADL, so that it is a source material for the history of ADL for new members coming on board to the various boards to have an opportunity to read that and learn in a nutshell what wonderful organization they're becoming a part of. I would suggest that our regional director take that back to the powers that be. Scott, I think that would be an excellent idea to work on. Aside from that, I'm always fascinated by what you say, Ken, and I look forward to hearing what you say for many years to come.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate it.
I will take that back, and it was recorded, and we're certainly making it available to the rest of the New York, New Jersey leadership, but we can consider making that more broad. Thanks, Larry.
Sure.
Ben Sachs, you're up next.
Thank you. Thanks, Kenny. That's, as always, amazing. One of the things that you sort of referenced throughout your talk back and forth on and off is that ADL has had to sort of dance a fine line in the political arena. So the organization has taken up things that are certainly politically sensitive, but has managed to essentially be non-political. Fast forward to today, social media, communications being what they are, everything seems so extraordinarily severe and polarized. How important do you think it is for the organization to continue to tread that fine line between left and right, Republicans and Democrats, so forth and so on? And are there things that we need to be doing today that we've never had to do in the past?
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, that what you're asking is actually one of my mantras, that I just think that it's so important for us to try to do it. Now, trying to do it is not the same as achieving it in today's world. It is much more difficult. For example, we have been attacked by both the right and the left for years. I mean, when I see recent attacks, I tell my colleagues who were not around, this is not new. I can go back 20, 30 years and people on the right were accusing us of all kinds of things, and people on the left. There is one big difference, however, and the difference is that in the old days, the center was so strong that we got so much support, and it was almost a badge of honor that we were attacked from both the right and the left, and we could point to, a strong kind of center. That today the center is much weaker. And I think that this kind of polarization is damaging. It's probably damaging to us. It's surely damaging to the democracy and to the society. I therefore think that trying to maintain a balanced, nonpartisan thing is even more important today than ever, because I think the society needs it more desperately now. It's not an easy business, and it doesn't always have to come out to be a moral equivalence, you know, to say there are different characteristics. I mean, if you want to talk about anti-Semitism, you know, there's no doubt that the violence from the right has been a terrible thing, and I wouldn't just simply throw in the stuff coming from the left in necessarily the same category. But there are other aspects about the left side of things that are more problematic. There's a certain kind of respectability to the left-wing anti-Semitism that makes it more legitimate and credible in some ways that the right-wing stuff is all rejected. So I think you have to make distinctions, but always try hard to speak to ADL on the issues and not on the politics of it. It's not an easy thing to do. I find myself with my colleagues constantly raising things. I sometimes think we could do a better job than we're doing. I think we overall are doing reasonably well, but I think we could do better. But everybody is so, you know, everybody sees the events through the prism of their partisan perspective today. It's just very hard to, but as I said, I think it's actually more important than ever now. Less so specifically for ADL and more so for our society. I believe trying to recreate a strong center in which people recognize that the other side is not the enemy and that compromise is a possibility is the greatest challenge we face today. And so anything that we can contribute to that, I think would be a huge, huge contribution. So I think it's important for us as an institution. I also think it's important for us as part of American society. So.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, I see John Harris's hand, so that'll be the last question. And go ahead.
Thanks. Gosh, Ken, I hope you can keep the answer to this one brief, because I know it's a large question. But you know, historically, you mentioned the separation of church and state, and certainly when Abe was the executive director, he spoke out often about the sort of infusion of religion into public life, into public spaces, the so-called, war against Christmas and all of that. It strikes me that the infiltration of religion and the separation of church and state is probably threatened more today. Certainly, some of the recent decisions by the Supreme Court are troubling, at least as to maintaining the wall between them. Is that still something that's core to ADL, or has ADL in reimagining itself made that a sort of second tier issue?
Yeah, I think that look, we've established our basic, what we call our pillars. The first pillar is the fight against anti-Semitism. The second one is combating extremism, and the third one is creating a just society. And I would say that this is part of the just society. I think we've always believed that maintaining the wall of separation is a vital part of our values. First, to fight anti-Semitism, but beyond that, to create a healthy society. So I'm trying to think of, I guess there haven't been major cases lately, and maybe John, you'll tell me if I'm wrong. I don't know if there's been a really major, I mean, of course, you had the other issues like the Hobby Lobby case, and there were other issues like that. I think these issues will continue to be important for ADL. If you're asking me whether ADL is moving away from those issues, look, there's no doubt that there's a lot of targeted focus on the issues of extremism because of what's going on. That's where most of the attention is these days. That's where, to be honest, ADL gets called on more. I mean, after January 6th, ADL was all over the media more than any other group because that's our expertise, and that's, to be honest, that's what people are interested now. And so sometimes it may look like some other issues may not be taking that first priority, but I don't sense anything in any way to suggest that when those issues come up, that ADL will not maintain its longstanding policies of it. So if there's if you're looking for some reassurance, I think there's a basis for it. But there's no doubt that there is. I mean, we have been, our senior staff are constantly talking about trying to keep our focus. Now, I'm a believer that ADL should, I have a mantra that I try to say to my colleagues, which is, I want ADL to focus on our niche, but I don't want to turn us into a niche organization. And what I mean by that is, yes, we should invest heavily in all the work we do on extremism, hate online, all those things, without a doubt. But the voice of ADL in American society has been really important. And I think that voice on a variety of issues that sometimes may not appear to be the immediate priority should never be lost. I think people look to ADL on a whole variety of issues, both as a moral voice, but also as a credible voice. I always like to say to people that over the years, I spent as much time saying when things are not anti-Semitism as when they are. In other words, I want people to pay attention when ADL says that's the problem, and so therefore you've got to distinguish. And we're living in a time where everything is, all the victimization and all that. I think it's very unhealthy for the real struggles that we have. And I think part of ADL's job is to tell it like it is and to remain honest about it and not always, Schweigewalt, but may wait for those moments that they are. So I'll just finish by saying that I go back to my point from the beginning of continuity and change. There are so many things that have changed, but I think the fundamentals of ADL, which have really sustained us through the decades, remain intact. So.
Ken, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining. I think that's such a great note to end on, because I think if we had the time, and we don't today, to go around and really ask everyone what brought them to ADL, it's probably something very different for each of us, and that's why it's so important to keep our voice in all the places, as you just mentioned. So thank you. I hope everyone
Great
can have a good holiday, and we'll see you at the next session. And please reach out to me if you have any feedback on how to do this going forward. Looking forward to hearing from all of you.
Bye.